Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In today's episode, we welcome the Early Caribbean Digital Archive team, led by Professor Nicole Aljo and Professor Elizabeth Dillon, to discuss the ECDA and how this repository can be used in family research. The ECDA is a publicly available archive platform for accessing research. So, let's listen in.
Thank you so much for the Early Caribbean Digital Archive team for coming on to the podcast, Dis-Affamie History. And before we start, I'll have you, each one, introduce yourselves briefly, and just to let the audience know who you are and what, in terms of what you do on this team for the Early Caribbean Digital Archive project. So Elizabeth, we'll go first with you.
Elizabeth Maddock Dillon, and I am a distinguished professor of English at Northeastern University, and I am the co-founder and co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. My literary research focuses on the 18th century Atlantic world, and the Caribbean was, of course, central to that world.
So Nicole N. Aljo, professor of English and Africana Studies at Northeastern University in Boston. I am the other co-founder and co-director of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. My own scholarship looks at 18th and early 19th century writing by and about Black people across the Black Atlantic, with a particular focus on the Caribbean and the slave narratives. And I also use Black feminist and post-colonial feminist theories to engage with notions of the colonial archive.
Thank you so much.
Do you want to go next?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Alana Prince. I am a PhD candidate here at Northeastern in the English department. I've been working with the ECDA for my entire time, well, almost my entire, just in pockets, time here. And my work is mostly on contemporary poetry, but particularly about poetry that is invested in sort of working with historical documents from the sort of 19th and 18th century.
Thank you.
Rita?
Sure. Hi, Wendy. Nice to meet you. Finally. My name is Reba Dixon. I am a second-year PhD student at Northeastern in the English department. I am the project manager with ECDA. My research looks at imaginations of Blackness as monstrosity, particularly right now focused on these imaginations as they pertain to Black women and the intersectional natures of their identities, and how society translates that into monstrosity, and looking at how to alleviate that, how Black women resist that. Yeah, that's kind of what I do right now.
Perfect. No, thank you so much, everyone, for that great introductions. And we'll start. So what would be, I guess, if you can be able to provide, I guess, an overview of the Early Caribbean Digital Archive project and its objectives?
So the Early Caribbean Digital Archive is a digital collection of archival material from and about the early Caribbean, which we understand as pre-20th century. Our focus is to make this material more accessible, because very often it is located on a variety of different islands, as well as in different metropolitan spaces like the UK, the United States, Canada, et cetera. So its goal is to gather this material so that research and engagement can be a little more accessible for folks.
And I'll add to that to say the project began maybe a decade ago. Does that sound right, Nicole?
Yep, 2012.
Yeah, so Nicole and I were both part of a group that was forming then called the Early Caribbean Society, which was a group of researchers from the United States who were interested in the early Caribbean, and particularly in the centrality of the early Caribbean to the Black Atlantic world of the 18th century. And we realized how difficult it was to access materials because of the reasons that Nicole just talked about, that these materials are really scattered due to the history of imperialism related to the Caribbean. So we thought, well, we'll just gather them electronically. We'll use our resources at Northeastern to do that. But one of the things that we quickly discovered is that even that process of gathering invites you in some ways to reproduce the imperial biases of the archive and the imperial, we could say imperial biases and erasures of the archive. So one of the things that we quickly moved to doing was trying to think about what it would mean to redress some of those imperial biases and erasures. So what would it mean to try to decolonize the archive as we were gathering those materials? So that has kind of turned into one of our primary objectives as well. What does it mean to decolonize knowledge as well as to make these sources available, more available to folks who are interested in this in the early Caribbean?
No, thank you both, because I know for myself, when I was researching in this area, it was very hard to find things, and it's great to know that there's now a repository for all of these items to be able to be centralized, because I was looking everywhere to find information or to gather information, and it can be rather challenging. So how does the Early Caribbean Digital Archives curate and digitize the contents of these items of the early Caribbean? Like, what's the process that goes into that?
So we started the process by thinking about what we could call like the foundational or canonical texts that we associate with the early Caribbean. So, this would be, things like, historical texts that were created in the 18th and 19th century about the early Caribbean, or travel journals, right, legal documents, medical treaties, that kind of thing. So the initial step was to gather these foundational materials, many of which were already digitized, and then just add those into our archive. But then as Elizabeth pointed out, what we quickly realized is that there were things that were left out. So then we began to look for additional materials, one of the things that Elizabeth kind of implicitly mentioned is our desire to decolonize the archive. And one of the ways that we do that is by going into these already digitized texts and kind of surfacing and highlighting the voices or the aspects of them that you wouldn't normally focus on if you had like the hard copy in front of you. So, for example, the narratives of lives of the enslaved. The period of slavery in the Caribbean, right, which technically kind of ended right between 1833 and 1838. That's much earlier than a lot of the slave narratives. It's a much earlier time than when a lot of the earlier slave narratives appeared in the United States. Frederick Douglass's very famous narrative, right, appears in 1845. So that's after enslavement ends in the Caribbean. So there isn't this long history of separately published slave narratives in the Caribbean. Instead, many of these portraits and narrative descriptions were embedded in other texts. So they were in travel narratives, medical treaties, law documents, they were spiritual conversion narratives, that kind of thing. And so one of the affordances of the digital is that, right, it allows you to go into a digital document and clip and kind of take these things out. So what we were able to do is we were able to create a number of additional documents, essentially, right? So we would go in, excise the embedded slave narrative, give it its own metadata so that now it exists as its own discrete item and document in our archive.
No, that's great.
So one of the aspects of the collection that were most that's most important to us is this process that Nicole was just describing of surfacing the voices of people who enslaved people whose voices don't appear in the archive, partly because of the way the archive is structured. So when I say that the archive is imperial, part of what I mean is that if you look at it in a traditional library catalog, it will say, this is the history of Jamaica as written by Brian Edwards, right? But then within Brian Edwards' text, we'll hear the stories of an enslaved person like Clara or Isaac. And this really builds on the important research of Professor Nicole Aljo about the importance of understanding embedded slave narratives as a testimony of the experience of enslaved people. So building on her theories, we've disembedded those narratives, and we've created a separate collection that includes Clara's narrative, Isaac's narrative, Rose's narrative from these different texts. And now you can look at them separately as a whole set of voices that starts to begin to give you a sense of the real people, the real voices, the real experiences of enslaved people that are not solely accessible by way of the white enslavers who previously are the only way to find those stories in the archive.
No, that's great, because as you said, these narratives are not really told, and you have to find them through somebody else. So I'm glad that this is being highlighted. So what types, and I guess my next question is basically the type, like how are things selected to be part of the Early Caribbean Digital Archives project?
I mean, it's pretty much open. So we started with the foundational texts, but we have been ingesting wherever we see that there are gaps, and ingesting text. So ingesting text meaning including additional texts in the archive, so we've done things like ingest texts around Indigenous voices. We were interested in text. We had an ingestion once that focused on natural histories. So it's pretty much open. I think the only kind of issue that we have, right, is time, yes. Right, and the fact that, right, we're all working on other projects in addition to this. We don't always have huge numbers of graduate and undergraduate students working with us, but the benefit of the ECDA and that it's open access. So we've also had other folks who are interested in using the archive to kind of create their own collections as well. And increasingly, we are working with some folks who have created these kind of like sub-collections. So for example, we're working with a graduate student who's at the University of Miami who is interested in investigating and exploring how disability shows up in the Colonial Caribbean archive. So that's another different collection. And there's some overlaps between that collection and some of the work that Reba wants to be doing for her eventual dissertation. Okay. But really, it's very kind of a dynamic kind of process. So it's not as though we have particular subjects and topics that we want to check off, mm-hmm. But we're really open to all of the various possibilities.
Okay.
The one of the ways in which, again, to think about what it means to decolonize the archive is to think about telling that history of the early Caribbean from a fundamentally different point of view. So not telling it as the story of this is how European planters showed up and made a lot of money, and which is often what the archive is interested in doing, is recording exactly that narrative, to instead think about what we think of as different paths through the archive. So, for instance, a path telling what is the story of individuals who experience disability while they're enslaved in the Caribbean. And so one of the focuses of our collection is then not so much being comprehensive, like getting everything, as it is storytelling. And the storytelling often takes the shape of building exhibits. And so one of these exhibits, for instance, one of our really most exciting exhibits was built by Alana on the topic of Obeah. And so maybe I'll just pass it off to her to say a little bit about that exhibit.
Yeah, sure. So I was really interested in, I suppose, creating an exhibit that had like a pretty substantive amount of historical documents, but they were also documents that were pretty, I mean, quite biased, as we talked about, like sort of colonial views of things, and they were a lot of legal documents. And so it was sort of this trying to understand, or I should say not legal, just legal, but like parliamentary documents. And I was trying to look at them and sort of read between the lines and understand like what might have actually been going on, because like for the people of Jamaica or elsewhere, like Obeah was this sort of emancipatory thing. It was also something that like gave them a sense of like empowerment or control to be able to sort of work towards or create I guess like the world they wanted to live in, or sort of the results they wanted for their lives. But the sort of British Parliament and others like were trying to create laws around it, and create laws that could control it. But I mean, it is a art of magic, of the sort of spiritual realm. And so there's this tension between like, you know, how do you control the intangible? How do you stop it? And it usually came through stopping the practice itself. I'm saying, you know, let's find the Obeah man or the Obeah woman and get them to stop. But as they sort of what's quickly found out was that like, even if you contain them or whatever, like it's sort of just, it's, I guess I would say it's impossible. They found that it was impossible. And I think that realization that like Obeah could not be controlled sort of further propagated it as this like tool for power, because it was like the one thing that couldn't be stopped. You know, like you could separate families, you could take away certain freedoms, but this was like something that could, I mean, again, could not be taken away. And I think that's how it again became so just so important. I think also just this piece, this exhibit that I drew outside of that, also was really about like how Obeah would then go on to shape cultural politics. So thinking about, you know, who practiced it, who accessed it, what they sort of were desiring, or what they were practicing Obeah in order to get, speaks a lot about just like the general values and what's the word? Thinking about, I guess, what people were envisioning for themselves, whether, you know, outside of just freedom. I think it's one of the really interesting things about Obeah, because it was so just like this opportunity for empowerment and for betterment. And I think those things really help us understand the sort of point of view and the perspectives and the needs of the people of that time in a way that maybe other documents don't always help us realize.
No, I would agree with you there, because I mean, it's all written in law and it's all about oppressing a set of people. So I guess with that, with the exhibit, could you just, I guess, walk us through, I guess, the website itself in terms of how to access and to navigate the actual website for the Early Caribbean Digital Archives?
When I came to the ECDA in 2017, which is so long, it's crazy to think, it was an Omeka site still. And Omeka is like it's a website that is sort of open source, but also is really good for hosting like repositories of things. And then so we were there, but those sites are kind of clunky, they're slow, and they're not super accessible unless you're like sort of on a laptop computer with a very good internet sort of speed. And so when I got here, Liz Polcha, or I should say Dr. Liz Polcha, who's now at Drexel, who is the project manager prior to me, was like, we need to do something about this. So we spent the next year and a half, I would say, moving it to Series, which is a Northeastern's own sort of WordPress site. And we really focused it on just having like a very clean website. Like we would sort of think about what Rupika Risam and Alex Gill talk about, sort of minimal computing, and just like thinking about how people are accessing actual technology, especially in the Caribbean, which was a lot of times through tablet or cell phone. So we wanted to design a site that was like that was going to work well on both of those things. And so that's kind of how we came up with this website design. And of course, along with our co-directors kind of checking us through. But that's kind of where it became when I think it was kind of, I would say it was completely rebuilt by 2019 in terms of like what we have, what you see now. There's been ingest since then, and I think a couple of exhibits have gone up. But like fundamentally the platform that we have now. And then I'll let Reba sort of walk us through what it looks like now, and then the next steps.
Perfect.
Sure. Thank you for that important segue. If you go and you search ECDA, our website is ecda.northeastern.edu. You'll find this page and you'll be greeted with our logo, which I genuinely love our logo.
Mm-hmm.
And so a few quotes, a little bit of information about us, and then you're prompted to take a tour. Depending on what you would like to see or access, you could go ahead into the archives. So if you click that explore button, we have a few directions on that. And also, if you are interested in contributing to the archives, like you can do that through here. I think that I personally really like this section up here because it's easier to just go through and navigate stuff. So let's say if I'm interested in the exhibits, I could click on the different types of exhibits, like the Obeah exhibit that Alana was referencing earlier. This is it here. And you could go through and, read more information about it, and you kind of like move sequentially through the tabs on the side. So it's, I would say, easy to navigate in that realm. So again, that's one exhibit. With regards to the archives, you could go in here. You would go here on the archive, browse. Again, if you want to learn about or contribute, you could click on these buttons and you would, get a chance to do that. I clicked on a button and it's loading now. Anyway, so if you would like to browse the archives, I'd recommend, my internet is slow. Ooh. Okay, yeah. So if you like to browse the different archives that we have in here, you would click on that. And then when it populates, you'll see the different documents that we have present for people to access, right? And you could sort through depending on how you would like to see them. So here we have some of the archives, archives that include embedded slave narratives, and that type of information in here. Is there any particular one? I know we mentioned earlier the embedded slave narrative. So if we click on this one, we could see embedded slave narratives about different individuals.
So just to quickly add that, so we have the large archive that has every document in it, and then we also have what we could call subcollections. So the embedded slave narrative is an example of one of the subcollections. So there's embedded slave narratives. I think if you go up to the archive, there's also an Obeah narratives collection. So the disability collection that we're working on now, so that will eventually be up there. We're in the middle of actually migrating. So the library and the technology services at Northeastern are updating this platform, the series platform. So it's likely in a couple of weeks that the website might look slightly different, but it'll still be essentially the same kind of structure. But because we're in the process of getting the new migration, like the indigenous subcollection and some of the others aren't available right now, but they will be in the next iteration.
Okay. So I'm just saying it probably just part of this next question, because again, this probably was, in terms of maintaining this database is probably one of the challenges, and of course, any upgrades. So can you speak, I don't know if you can speak a little bit to some of the other challenges that may be faced in developing and of course maintaining ECDA?
Sure. I mean, a major challenge is funding, right? So
Yes.
It costs money to do this. I mean, the university has been incredibly generous with us over the years. And Elizabeth and I each, have some funding to hire PhD students to work on the project. We've also been lucky in that Northeastern is very invested in what it calls experiential learning, particularly for undergraduates. So this idea that students are not just learning things in the classroom, but they're also kind of working with faculty on their individual research, they're working out in the community, that kind of thing. And so consequently, there's this whole host of programming at Northeastern for undergraduates, so they can apply for funding to work with us. And we've had a number of undergraduates work with us through that venue, which has been fabulous. I think only maybe one out of, and I think maybe at this point it's like 15 students, only one of them has been an English major or history major. The vast majority of the students, the undergraduates that we end up working with, are far afield from literary and historical studies, which is actually fantastic because then they bring their expertise. So we had a student who was really interested. She's I'm going to get it wrong, a neurobiology. I'm thinking about Natalie Hackman's
Wow.
major, like neurobiology, biochemistry, something like that, but medicine, broadly speaking. And so because of that, her interest in the archive and the archival documents focused around that. And so she developed a really lovely collection, not only in terms of medicine, but she also created a really great exhibit that focused on maternal health. And the ways that, documentation and ideas about maternal health, particularly of enslaved women, were circulating at this time. So it's been really wonderful, I think, working with the students from the various disciplines, and really has helped to kind of deepen our engagement with the archive in really fulfilling kinds of ways.
Yeah, most definitely. And just as a side, can anyone be able to, I guess, donate to the ECDA in terms of help to maintain the website in addition to what the university is doing as well?
Yeah, so we're in the, as I said, we're in the process of migration, but definitely one of the really rewarding aspects has been working with folks in the community, working with other scholars. So there's a section called the classroom, and that's where we have, created some curriculum materials that you can use in the classroom, but there's also been stuff that folks have added for us in terms of like undergraduate work, that kind of thing. Yeah, as we move forward, we'd like to be to create a more stable process for inviting folks. So currently we just have the button, right? So you click on the button, it takes you to, I think, a Google form, or it goes directly to our email, which we had difficulty accessing the email during COVID, but we now have access to that email. And so we are hopeful moving forward that we'll be able to incorporate more. But we have had a couple of exhibits created by folks who are not at Northeastern. I don't know, Elizabeth, if you want to talk about Devon's exhibit on music and how that came about.
Yeah, so one of the exhibits that, again, that we're really proud of is called the Jamaican Heirs. And again, just to reiterate what Reba said, if you go to our main page and there's a menu on the top and you click on exhibits, those exhibits will come up. And the Jamaican Heirs is a nice example. This was a graduate student named Devon Lee at the University of California, Davis. He's probably a professor somewhere by now, actually, but he was doing research at the British Library in the papers of Edward Long, and Edward Long was a enslaver and a proponent of slavery in Britain as well. He published a very well-known text called The History of Jamaica in 1774. But he was also busy trying to make the case that slavery was a good thing. And in order to do that, he did a lot of sort of ethnographic, anthropological work where he was collecting materials about the culture of enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. Now, he wanted to use this material for horrible, nefarious purposes, which is to make the case that Africans should be enslaved. But some of the material that he recorded, if you take it out of the context he used it in, it's actually quite clear that it makes the opposite case, which is to say, here is this rich and important and vibrant culture that the archive has basically hidden away. And so what Devon did was he found transcribed music that was written by enslaved people for performance at these John Canoe performances. So he put together, this has never been published before because it was in the manuscript edition of the Long. He put together these songs that are written by enslaved people and published them on this website. And they're really amazing because we don't have any documentation. This is the only documentation that we have. So the irony is that the documentation was made for these very negative reasons, but if we put it together, which we did, and he did in this exhibit, it assumes a completely different meaning, which is, here's this incredible history that we have not had access to because enslaved people did not have access to print, to the resources to write, to publish, to maintain written documentation of their culture. So that's an example of the exhibit. One of the things that is maybe worth emphasizing is that in decolonizing knowledge means democratizing it. And so one of the things that we do as a group, as a ECDA, is first of all that we function as a group. So we're working with undergraduates, with graduate students, with faculty members, and with people at other institutions. So we really kind of work as a collective. And one of the principles that we've arrived at through our work is that the archive is not an inert, fixed body of knowledge. The archive is really something that is made through the ways in which we use that knowledge, the way that we assemble and reassemble and disassemble that knowledge. And the more we think about how we do that together, the more it can be accessible in different ways. So the story of Obeah that Alana's exhibit tells, or the story of cultural tradition, performance, music that Devon's exhibit tells. So the teaching materials are really important to us on the site because they invite people. We want to invite people to kind of put their hands into this material and do things with it, as opposed to just say like, oh, that's knowledge, it's over there, right? It's not over there. It's something that we make every time we touch it. So we want to kind of foreground that making and the possibilities of that. And so we try to do that both through the exhibits and through the teaching materials, which are a great way for people to engage with the archive.
No, that's great. And the fact that you can take that Jamaican Heirs exhibit and kind of show it for not necessarily for the framework where it was originally presented, but to take out and extract that information and present it kind of in a new light so people can digest it a lot better, as opposed to the, I guess, the more known of his work. So I thought that's really great. And so I guess what is now then part of, I guess, the future plans or expansions of ECDA? Are there any upcoming projects or initiatives that are coming up?
We have a number of exhibits that are kind of, a hair's breadth away from being put up on the site. So one of them is a collection of fugitive slave ads, runaway slave ads from the Barbados Mercury that we've hooked up with another platform called Zooniverse, where we invite people to transcribe from the original print edition to transcribe those advertisements, and that will allow people to help in both reading and engaging in those ads, but also building a corpus of digital text that people could then analyze, which they can't do from just the images from the PDF. We have another amazing exhibit on Makandal, who's a figure from who is a sort of important Maroon leader, if you will, in Saint-Domingue prior to the Haitian Revolution. And there's a whole wealth of texts that have been generated around his history and the importance of his history. And that exhibit is will be up on our new website that we've been working with the library as they migrate to a new system. So there's always like the back end issues that Nicole was mentioning earlier, but I do want to promise people that there's more to come.
Okay. So I guess these are part of the opportunities that are coming up for collaboration and contribution that people can make in terms of, especially with the, as you said, the the runaway slave narratives, that they can be able to assist with that. And so just, I guess, this has been great, but I guess as we, kind of come to an end here, were there any final items that you wanted to bring to everybody's attention that wasn't discussed that we could say about ECDA?
I'd like to invite Reba and or Alana to say a little bit about the experience of working with the ECDA, because I think that it's we often, when I say we, I mean myself and Nicole, who started this, but the leadership of the projects often comes from the graduate students who have been doing the real work in the trenches, and it's always exciting to see what that work is and how it has informed the work of the graduate students. So Reba, would you like to jump in and say anything about that?
Sure. So I work with ECDA as the project manager, and before that, I was a normal graduate student working with ECDA. And I guess I took for granted how much the project manager does, because you would attend the meetings and we report back on the work that you're doing after reading archival documents and explicating and all that. But to be in the position to have to organize the meetings, to communicate with the team and outside individuals, and to be so actively engaged. Like, I don't have to ask if Dr. Dillon or Dr. Aljo wants me to come to this, because yes, they do. It's not even, it's so heavily implied. It's not a question at this point. And I think that I really appreciate, because I know that they have the faith and confidence in me to me and Alana, because I believe Alana has been in this position as well, to lead the program. And it just gives you so much hands-on experience. One, working with different individuals, because we have a very intergenerational group, but also working with professionals. So going out there and actually meeting people and being introduced to them by Doctors Aljo and Dillon, and also just like jumping in and just going and talk to people. Like, all of these things I really appreciate. I think, yeah, like for me, it's very hands-on. It's so into what I want to do, and the possibilities for my own research are just so endless, because like with my work now, I'm taking a more artistic lean. So I'm excited to, one, have my project exhibited with ECDA one day, and like the shape that will take, and also the fact that there really is no set criteria as to what an exhibit could be about, what it should be about, like really decolonizing and destabilizing what we believe an archive should look like, I think is very important to the work. And one thing I did want to do, because I didn't get a chance to do it, I wanted to share my screen one more time. To look up here to the classroom section, where we have some resources, including syllabi for teachers or individuals who are just interested, and some different assignments that are present on the website. So I did want to include that just for like viewers to see. Again, you would click up here, classroom, resources for teachers, and like there's a slew of other options there. So you could see the featured students projects and that type of thing. So yeah, ECDA is just so interested in decolonizing and not having, like, I heard it recently, like a leading actor type of thing, like a leading protagonist story. No, it's everyone included, and everyone gets a chance to engage, and everyone's opinions and ideas are valued. So yeah. Alana, would you like to join in?
Yeah, no, I think you said so much so beautifully. The one thing I will say, and I think I've actually told this story before, is that entering the PhD program, I remember getting a call from Professor Dillon in the middle of summer, offering me a position as like a research assistant on the early Caribbean Digital Archive. And I was like, well, I don't know. Like, I don't know anything about the digital. I am a contemporary. I study the contemporary I don't know if I'm qualified. I kind of was well, I didn't say that, but I remember talking to my boss. Prior to this, I was in teaching, and she was like, just take it. I was like, well, I don't know anything about this. Like, she's like, just take it. Don't worry. You'll figure it out. That's how it always goes. And so I called back and agreed to the position. Despite, again, I was an art history major in undergrad. English was my minor. And I was studying like the sort of ultra contemporary sort of work of the past 5 years. And I go in to our first meeting, and I'm just like, oh, I feel like an imposter. I really shouldn't be here. I don't, they're talking about Omeka and digital archives in the 18th century. I don't know anything about any of this. But between the group, and at the time, I think it was just me, Liz Polcha, Professor Dillon, and Professor Aljo. And within a few weeks, I just immediately felt very comfortable and very wanted, and I had something to contribute. And as I actually kept going deeper and deeper, I realized that, my ultra contemporary work is actually, it's not a perfect 1-to-1 ratio from history to present, but a lot of the things that I was studying and trying to work through very much were embedded into these sort of narratives, and they were so intermixed and intermingled. And I was like, oh, the questions are really in the past. I mean, I know people say history repeats itself, but it also just builds on itself. And so it, as someone who came in thinking I was going to study contemporary novels, it completely reshaped and repaved the path that I was on. And now I study poetry, and I study, historical documents, and the sort of the uptake of historical documents in contemporary work. So for me, it was really transformational, not just in terms of new research skills or sort of increased responsibilities and being able to take ownership of stuff. It was really really transformative, my worldview and my research. So I will say that.
No, that's really nice to hear. And as I said, I think what you've done here is just fantastic, because I've had to download all of these books and keep them on a flash drive. And now I know there's somewhere I can actually just go to, and I have to go back and bring out my flash drive and go, okay, which book was this and which passage did I read? And you've already, detailed everything so nicely on your website. It's fantastic, and it's a really great resource. So, I do thank you, Dr. Aljo, Dr. Dillon, Alana, and Reba for coming on and to speak about this, because I really do think it's really important, and it's a great repository that people can be able to use and hopefully be able to contribute as well further down the line. So thank you so much for taking your time. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you for having us. Yes.
Thank you so much.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.